I do want to start the show with Dr. Fauci's comments when he was talking to Snapchat's Peter Hamby yesterday. Because obviously, the biggest question right now and the only real talking point in the sports world is when will sports resume, right? Will the NBA have their season again? Will the NHL resume their season again? If so, will they skip right to the playoffs? Could they have a truncated regular season? What could it look like if sports resume, and more importantly, when sports resume, right? And baseball is kind of having, their same issue. They want to play as many games as possible. Obviously, their season, they never even got started, so they're delayed. So their question is, how can we get back to playing, and how can we make up as many games as possible? That is why you hear creative thinking, especially from the MLB's perspective, because they have a lot more season to make up than the NBA and the NHL. So you have to get extra creative on how they can try to figure out ways to have players both be safe, which is obviously the most important part, but also get these games in and give, America a distraction, and more importantly, also get that TV revenue money. Let's not kid ourselves. The leagues and these commissioners can say they want to be the league to come back, to give us a distraction, to help America heal, to restart the economy. Let's also let's not be naive here. They want to come back because they realize the TV money is going to be massive, because especially with fans not going in to start, and honestly, most likely and possibly not going in at all the rest of this calendar year. They need that TV money, and that is the only revenue they're going to get in. So they want to return, and they want to get that TV revenue money as quick as possible. So Dr. Fauci is really the only person qualified to discuss if sports come back, when sports come back, and if they do come back, what it would look like, right? You can have coaches talk, you can have commissioners talk, you can have players talk, you can have even some doctors talk, but all of those opinions, for the most part, are irrelevant because they have no background in science and no background in how to contain the coronavirus. And more importantly, as Dr. Fauci has said multiple times, and I'm sure you've heard it nauseum already, the virus makes the timeline, right? Nothing we do for the most part, or I should say nothing leagues want to do, can help speed up the timeline, can help speed up the process of recovering. So he's really the guy that would have the most idea and the most sense about when and if leagues could return and how it happens. And he made some news yesterday. Unfortunately, while it sounded positive on the outlook, right? Because you look at all the headlines, whether you go to ESPN, CBS, even some news headlines. The headline was, Dr. Fauci thinks that sports can return this summer. And you watch the video that Snapchat put out. Again, he talked with Peter Hamby on his Snapchat feed. And the question was asked, could sports resume and what it would look like? And the headline and the quotes you read are, sports can resume. And basically what he said, generally, without being edited, which is important, because we'll get to that in a second, that basically if sports mirror some sort of idea of what MLB is doing, where you quarantine the players, you basically have them come in contact with no one else, you test rapidly, you test frequently, sure, it could work. It could work, it'd be practical, it has a chance of actually turning out to be a smart idea. Now, the issue is that wasn't the full answer, and really it was edited to make it sound better than actually what he said. And Fauci, if you read the entire transcript, which I saw on Vanity Fair, which is the only place that at least I've seen so far that has full transcript of the full answer about whether sports and if sports could return this summer. And he said, sure, sports could return this summer, and if they follow this model, essentially, again, what the MLB is doing, which is you put players in one city, you make sure they're extra quarantined. You make sure they're not coming in contact with anyone on the outside. You test them rapidly and frequently, daily, maybe twice daily if possible. Make sure that whatever happens, the results of someone is sick or not. And you basically try your best to make sure these players don't get sick and prevent as many outside sources of getting them sick as possible. But he said, that is a big if, essentially. And this is also important. He said, this can happen, but more importantly, games cannot be played without fans. And, having players being put in hotels, then testing them daily, playing the season out. He said, as long as they aren't infecting anyone, this is Dr. Fauci's quote. I mean, that's a really artificial way to do it, but when you think about it, it might be better than nothing, end quote. So he's right. I mean, theoretically, it's a tough ask, and on the surface, it seems practical. All right, just put them in a corner. Don't have them interact with anyone. They go to the stadium. They go to the hotel room. Theoretically, that's what they're doing now, except they're not playing sports. So there's no real difference between their exposure, I should say, when they're playing baseball compared to right now when basically all you're doing is going home and staying home. If that's what we do, except you go to the baseball field and go back, as long as we're testing, it should be fine. And it's interesting because just the day before, so on Tuesday, Sports Illustrated and their great writer Stephanie Apstein put out an article that basically tried to burst the bubble and basically give a realistic approach from medical experts, which is most important, about why sports won't be turning anytime soon. And Stephanie didn't give her opinion, but she spoke with multiple medical experts, and basically they took the MLB's Phoenix plan, which again is essentially what Dr. Fauci was using as example. Quarantine, put players in a city, quarantine them in hotels, test them all the time, and as long as they're fine, theoretically, baseball should be allowed to play. That's a sport that there's not much physical contact, right? It's not basketball or hockey where you're body to body with someone, right? I mean, obviously, baseball is probably the most socially distant team sport that you can have. So, in theory, it sounds good, but when Apstein and she quotes a few medical experts, they kind of break down this idea and poke holes in it. So for the MLB, for this idea to actually work, right? And this is what the experts she talked to said, and this is why it's going to be so hard, if not impossible, for MLB to pull off a biodome idea, per se. And that is, so the steps that have to be taken were, right away, so if this is going to happen, right? Let's say June 1st is the target date. Let's just make a random date. That is the day the league is going to resume. Well, first of all, before you do anything, before you have spring training, before you get practice, before you have the team even together, you have to fly everyone to the city, which in this case is Phoenix, have them in quarantine for 2 weeks. So wherever they're coming from, New York, California, Washington, Texas, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, every state that these players are coming from, these players in every state, they all fly to Phoenix. First thing you do, you're in the hotel room for 2 weeks quarantined. That's everyone. And that's not even just including players. That's team officials. That is hotel workers, chefs, bus drivers, umpires, media, if the media will be allowed there. Everyone that's going to be around the sport has to be quarantined for 2 weeks right away to ensure they aren't sick, they aren't carriers, and they aren't bringing the virus into this quarantine city. Now, once that happens, obviously abundant testing has to be necessary. That is a prominent factor. You have to have testing that is rapid, so you can get tests within the hour, within a few hours. You have to have tests that are frequent enough where you can have them for every player, every team official, everyone associated with the game that'll be there that day. And maybe even have multiple tests, 2 or 3 per person, just in case. You can test them before the game, test them after the game, to make sure and ensure that no player has any even sort of symptoms of the coronavirus, to make sure that this virus doesn't spread to more players. And then you have to make sure, and basically anyone that comes in or comes out of the biodome, right? And they made a good example of EMT workers, to where, let's say, a baseball player sprains his ankle, right? Normally, that's not a big deal. You go see your trainer, and then you have to go to the hospital maybe to get an x-ray or get it taped up. That's fine. But in this situation, if you leave the biodome, if you leave the quarantine area, to where the quarantine area is basically relegated to the stadium and your hotel room, that's really the only 2 places players can go, right? They can't go to the park. They can't go to the supermarket. You have to ensure that these players aren't exposing themselves to anyone outside of Major League Baseball. So even if they go to the hospital to get an MRI, let's say, right? Because we see that often. So many players get MRIs throughout the season regularly. It's not that big of a deal. Well, now it's a huge deal because they have to go to the hospital. Basically, you're breaking that quarantine. You're going out into the outside, the unknown world, let's say. So now you have to, once you go out there, you get an MRI on your shoulder. Let's say the MRI comes back negative, right? You're fine. Okay, you rested for a day or 2 and you should be fine. Well, you have to quarantine yourself for 2 weeks after that, because you exposed yourself. You went out, you broke the biodome, you broke the quarantine. Now you have to quarantine yourself for 2 weeks. So I'm sure teams are going to be reluctant and hesitant and try everything in their power to make sure these players aren't going to outside sources to seek medical attention and medical help. So this is a huge and maybe even impossible task that is going to be asked by Major League Baseball and by any other sport that returns, that has to basically, follow this sort of outline and this sort of plan. Because Dr. Fauci said this, while it's an artificial plan and it's maybe the best thing that, like, the only way that sports could resume, doesn't mean it's realistic, doesn't mean players will buy in. You've had all players already discuss and say, like, they are skeptical, because guess what? Players have wives. If those wives are pregnant and they give birth, let's say in June or July, you want to be there for it, right? Well, you can go. They're not saying you can't go, but if you do go, once you return, you have to be quarantined for 2 weeks. So, usually paternity leave or bereavement leave, unfortunately, if someone is sick or passes away, that's usually a few days. Fine, you go to the funeral, you be with your family. That's, again, not a big deal. But now it becomes a larger deal because you could still do that sort of thing. You could still go see your family. You could still go see a loved one that's sick or, God forbid, passes away. But if you do that, you're quarantined for 2 weeks as soon as you come back. So now it's 2 weeks that your team is without you, especially if you're a big-time player. Obviously, you could see the impact that that's going to have. So it really comes down to this, and it boils down to this. If there is no vaccine, which you hear experts, you hear doctors talk about the earliest is 12 to 18 months, and this was back in March or February. So best case scenario, maybe at the earliest, 2021 in January, February, we'll have a vaccine, unless something breakthrough happens in the next few months or a few weeks. So really, if there's no vaccine, unfortunately, the only way that these leagues can continue is with a vaccine, because guess what? Right now, there's still no answer to it. If someone does get sick, there's the only way to prevent it from spreading, the only way to prevent people getting sick is to shut down the entire league and quarantine for 2 weeks. And you're not going to quarantine one team or half of a team for, let's say, 2 weeks and continue the league with 29 teams or 28 teams. All of a sudden, next thing you know, you get to the end of the year, and some teams have played 80 games, some teams have played 60 games. There's too many variables and too many wild cards here to where if one thing goes wrong, the entire league is shut down. We talked about this when the Phoenix plan came out for MLB. Nothing from when the NBA shut down, when Rudy Gobert tested positive, and I believe it was March 12th, if I'm not mistaken, March 11th, just about a month ago, right? Nothing medically has come from that point on to now to where it is safe to play, or there is a way that you can prevent someone from getting sick or spreading it without quarantining everyone that's come in contact with that person. Right? And even though baseball is a socially distant sport, you have the outfielders, you have the infielders, everyone is separate from each other. There's really no bodily contact, let's say, right? For the most part, you still have players touching the ball. You still have a pitcher licking his hands, throwing the ball. The catcher catches it, throws it back. If the ball is put in play, you have the shortstop touching the ball. You have the pitcher touching the ball. You have the catcher touching the ball. You have the first baseman touching the ball. Any ball put in play, you have 3 or 4 players touching the ball. So there's still a way that the coronavirus could spread, even in baseball, even in a sport where you're not sweating on each other, there's not much physical contact. There's still a way the virus can spread. And right now, the best way to prevent spreading is by quarantining yourself, isolating those who are sick. So unfortunately, again, Dr. Fauci kind of outlined this without being too dark or too devastating, trying to put it gently. But, there's really no way that these leagues can resume unless there is a vaccine, unless there is a way that you can treat someone who is sick immediately and all those affected immediately and, again, prevent them from being quarantined for 2 weeks, essentially. So I'd love to hear your thoughts. I mean, again, Dr. Fauci talked about there's a chance sports come back. All has to go right, essentially. That's what he's basically saying. Every break has to go right. The players have to be quarantined. You have to make sure that no matter what, no one breaks outside of this quarantine city. No one, ventures away from their hotel room outside of just going to the ballpark. So think about that. You're asking these players, think about how hard it is for you and me right now to be at home 24/7, essentially, right? Sometimes we go for a walk around the block. We go to the grocery store. There are small ways we can get out and at least get a change of scenery. If nothing else, just get a breath of fresh air. Well, these players can't do that. I understand they'll be outside of the baseball field, so you'll have at least some sort of way to be outside, get some fresh air, and just get a change of scenery. But they can only go from the baseball field to their hotel room. That's it. They are not allowed to go to the grocery store. They can't go for a walk in the park because they can't risk exposure to anyone. Even if they keep their social distance, even if they wear a mask and gloves, you still have to make sure that these players are mitigating the risk as much as possible, meaning they'll basically have no lives, no family, and can't do anything outside of playing baseball and staying at their house or hotel for 3 months, 4 months on end until maybe it's possibly safe to have sports go back to their respective home cities and play in front of empty stadiums. But it's going to be a few months before that's even possibly the case. So you're asking for a lot. I know, again, we're kind of repeating ourselves from when we talked about the MLB Phoenix plan, but it's interesting to hear Dr. Fauci kind of finally talk about when and if sports could resume, and he's basically echoing what we've been saying and what a lot of experts have been saying. First of all, there's no way of knowing. There's no answer. There's zero timeline. The virus makes a timeline, and right now, theoretically, a quarantined league could work. It's going to be very tough to implement and execute. And unfortunately, again, until there's a vaccine, until there's some sort of way to treat coronavirus patients without quarantine for 2 weeks and then having to force everyone who's come in contact with that person to quarantine for 2 weeks, I don't see how any leagues resume. It's painful to hear, but it's going to be very tough for sports to resume in the summer.